Linda Curtis set out on that drive believing it would be temporary, a stretch of road she had traveled before, a destination that still existed in her mind as reachable. Nothing about her decision suggested finality. She wasn't running from something, and she wasn't chasing urgency. She was simply trying to get through a day complicated by weather that looked inconvenient, not dangerous. Rain had been falling steadily, the kind that blurs the horizon without announcing catastrophe. The highway ahead was still open. Traffic still moved. The world had not yet decided that this was the moment things would go wrong. Linda's car merged into the flow as it always had, carrying with it the assumption that roads, even flooded ones, ultimately lead somewhere safe. What makes her disappearance so unsettling is how reasonable it all seemed at the time. Flood warnings had become familiar background noise. Water on the roadway was no longer shocking. People adjusted, slowed down, pressed on. Linda did the same. There was no dramatic choice, no reckless turn, just a continuation of forward motion in a situation that hadn't yet revealed its true cost. When she failed to arrive, concern didn't erupt. It hesitated. Delays made sense under the conditions. Phones losing signal made sense. A longer route made sense. Everything still fit within the boundaries of explanation. But as hours passed, those explanations began to thin. The kind of thinning that doesn't break suddenly, but stretches until it's transparent. The highway remained visible. The rain eventually eased. Other drivers reached home. Linda Curtis did not. Her car wasn't found abandoned along the road. There were no calls asking for help. No witnesses stepped forward with a clear account of seeing her in trouble. It was as if the road itself had decided to keep the moment to itself. A moment where visibility narrowed, water rose just enough, and one vehicle crossed an invisible line without the world noticing. Flooded highways are deceptive that way. They look passable right up until they aren't. They don't collapse or explode. They don't announce failure. They wait for weight, momentum, and timing to align. And when they do, the transition from control to helplessness can happen in seconds, leaving behind no sound loud enough to travel beyond the rain. Linda Curtis disappeared into that quiet margin, not into darkness, not into chaos, but into a gap created by ordinary decisions made under extraordinary conditions. And by the time anyone realized that her journey had ended somewhere along that flooded stretch of highway, the water had already erased the path back to her. The road reopened. Traffic resumed. The surface looked unchanged. Linda did not. The last confirmed trace of Linda Curtis existed within a narrowing window of time, shaped by weather and movement. Her phone activity showed nothing unusual. No urgent calls, no messages that hinted at fear or hesitation. She remained connected to the world right up until the moment she wasn't. And when that connection ended, it did so without explanation. The highway she traveled had become unpredictable, not because it was fully submerged, but because it wasn't. Patches of standing water reflected headlights and sky, disguising depth and current. Drivers adjusted instinctively, relying on judgment formed in calmer conditions. Linda moved through that environment the same way others did, cautiously, steadily, without realizing how little margin for error remained. What investigators later pieced together was not a moment of panic, but a sequence of near misses that likely went unnoticed. Water creeping higher in low-lying sections. Drainage overwhelmed gradually, not violently. The kind of change that doesn't demand an immediate stop, but quietly reduces options with every passing second. No one remembered seeing her pull over. No one recalled her car stalled with hazard lights blinking through the rain. There were no reports of a sudden collision or debris scattered across lanes. The absence of those details suggested something far more subtle. A vehicle meeting water deep enough to take control without leaving obvious evidence behind. As conditions worsened, visibility dropped unevenly. Headlights refracted through rain and mist. Road markings faded. Depth became impossible to judge. And somewhere along that stretch, Linda's car likely encountered water that looked no different from what she had already passed through, until it behaved differently. Once a vehicle begins to lose traction in moving water, the process is unforgiving. Control doesn't disappear all at once. It slips away in stages, each one faster than the last. Steering becomes suggestion. Braking becomes irrelevant. And when the road gives way to current, there is no clear moment that announces the transition. After that point, the highway stops being a guide. It becomes a boundary. The final trace of Linda Curtis was not a dramatic signal or a cry for help. It was the sudden end of forward progress, a moment where the road no longer led where it promised. And because that moment occurred amid rain, water, and low visibility, it left nothing behind for others to notice. By the time the storm began to recede, Linda's journey had already passed beyond the reach of the highway itself. When Linda Curtis failed to arrive, the response unfolded within the constraints imposed by the environment itself. Flooding doesn't just erase roads, it limits perception. It reshapes priorities. Emergency efforts were stretched across multiple incidents, each demanding attention in real time. Vehicles stranded, neighborhoods cut off, calls coming in faster than they could be resolved. Within that context, Linda's absence initially blended into the wider disruption caused by the storm. Authorities began with what they could confirm: entry points to the highway, exit ramps, areas where drivers had already reported trouble. Patrols moved through sections of road once the water receded enough to allow access. They searched for abandoned vehicles, signs of impact, anything that would suggest where Linda's journey might have stopped. But flooded highways don't leave evidence the way dry roads do. Water carries it away. It presses debris flat. It smooths over disturbance until everything looks passable again. The lack of witnesses complicated everything. People had driven that highway under similar conditions, each focused on their own safe passage. Visibility had been poor. Attention narrowed. No one had reason to remember a single car among many, especially one that didn't crash loudly or block traffic. If Linda's vehicle left the roadway gradually rather than violently, it could have happened without drawing a single glance. Search efforts expanded outward, following the logic of where someone might go after encountering trouble. Side roads were checked. Nearby service areas were contacted. Waterways adjacent to the highway were noted, but without a precise location to focus on, those areas were vast. Floodwater doesn't respect boundaries. It spreads, connects, and then withdraws, leaving behind uncertainty instead of direction. As days passed, the landscape shifted again. The water drained away. The highway reopened. Traffic returned. What had once been an active emergency zone reverted to infrastructure. With no vehicle recovered and no clear point of departure from the road, the case lost immediacy without losing importance. It entered a quieter phase, one shaped not by indifference, but by limitation. For Linda's family, the silence was agonizing. They were left trying to imagine an event no one had seen, in conditions that no longer existed. The storm that might have explained everything was gone, replaced by normalcy that felt almost cruel in its indifference. Each day without answers forced them to live in a state of suspended understanding, where every possibility remained open because none could be confirmed. Flooded highways create blind spots that persist long after the water is gone. They alter the landscape briefly, then restore it without explanation. And somewhere within that altered moment, Linda Curtis had vanished in a way that left no clear path for those trying to find her. The shift came not from urgency, but from reconsideration. As time passed and initial search parameters yielded nothing, attention returned to what the storm had changed rather than what it had revealed. Flooding doesn't simply disrupt roads, it reshapes the environment temporarily, creating paths and dangers that vanish once the water recedes. Investigators began to focus on those temporary conditions, asking where the water had gone and what it might have taken with it. Drainage channels, culverts, and low-lying areas near the highway were reviewed more carefully. These were places designed to manage excess water, not to be searched for missing vehicles. During heavy flooding, they become extensions of the roadway itself, capable of pulling anything with enough momentum into spaces never intended for traffic. What made them difficult to search was also what made them dangerous. Narrow access, unstable ground, and water that still moved quietly below the surface. It was in one of these areas that attention finally settled. A section of terrain that had been completely submerged during the storm, then returned to an unremarkable state afterward. From the highway, it looked like nothing more than a drainage area doing its job. From above, there were no obvious signs of disturbance, but beneath the surface, something didn't align with the natural contours of the ground. When equipment was brought in to examine the area more closely, the process was slow and deliberate. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden confirmation, just an outline emerging where none should have existed, a shape consistent with metal rather than earth, positioned in a way that suggested movement guided by water rather than intention. The recovery effort confirmed what the investigation had been missing since the beginning. Linda Curtis's vehicle had been carried off the highway during the flood, pulled into a space designed to disappear once the storm passed. The conditions that caused the incident had also concealed it. By the time the water drained away, the evidence had already been absorbed into the landscape. The realization reframed the storm itself. What had seemed like an external complication was, in fact, the mechanism. The highway hadn't simply been dangerous that day, it had been temporarily transformed into something else entirely. And within that transformation, Linda's final journey had ended, without witnesses, without sound, and without leaving a mark that survived the weather.